I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that he read Voltaire on his campaign in Russia. So what I wanted to ask this question, he was somebody that, as far as I know, represented as someone who was a fan of the ideas of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Now, uh, some would say that it was obvious that he didn't practice them later, since he was an autocrat and things like that. What's your stance on that? Uh, how do you see him and the Enlightenment and that those philosophies that flourished in those times? And do you know if he did he ever had a chance to meet any of the Enlightenment philosophers, maybe?
He comes a little bit late to meet some of them. So Rousseau, Voltaire, of course, all died before he came of
I
prominence.
don't know their age when exactly was, they were dead and born.
So some of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment in France, at least, and people who would later be seen as having sort of created the intellectual movement that led to the revolution, they all die in like the middle of the 18th century, except one, which is the Abbé Raynal. And Napoleon meets him. Napoleon sort of wants to be a writer when he's young. He's completely obsessed with the philosophers of the Enlightenment, like Rousseau, like Voltaire, and he tries to pitch some of his book ideas to the Abbé Raynal. And of course, Abbé Raynal is sort of very tolerant with his young teenage admirer, and he tells him, "Oh, you should write a history of Corsica." So Napoleon starts to write a history of Corsica. It never comes to anything, but yes, so he did meet some of them. Your question is a very good one, and the answer is very paradoxical. On one hand, he is the incarnation of the Enlightenment. So he is the great reformer. He's the great unifier of the French civil code. He ends feudalism wherever he goes with his conquest. He abolishes the Jewish ghettos in the Papal States. He establishes meritocracy. He modernizes civil institutions. So he's the great man of reason and of the Enlightenment. And as you also point out, he at the same time, as the years go by, institutes one of the most draconian censorships in French history, completely muzzling the intellectual publications of France. The same guy who reads all day, who loves authors, who loves literature, is the guy who creates the most insupportable censorship in history. I mean, it's so weird. So it's a great paradox. I think there's a change in him. When he's young, he's completely obsessed with the philosophers and the Enlightenment, and he wants to become a writer, and he enters some essay contest and he writes this essay which is just completely plagiarized from Rousseau. Okay. And then he starts in the military achieving some victories, and then he sort of forgets and moves on from the Enlightenment and the life of thinking and ideas, and he becomes a diehard pragmatist and a diehard opportunist, very concrete. And he's like, okay, clearly I'll never be a writer. Now the military is the option for me, and I can achieve success through there. And then even his readings change. So he stops reading so much philosophy, and he now focuses on history and on the military arts. So there is a very interesting change. I forget, one author talked about it's like there's a moment in his life when he decides no longer to think but to act. And
Mm.
all of his life, of course, is the great culmination of the act. I mean, all his life, he was obsessed with action instead of deliberation. Famously, they said, "Oh, before him, the directorate wanted to make the Great Civil Code also, but they never do it. People wanted to create the lycée." The primary school, but they never do it. And he does everything, right? Whether you agree with the decision or not is a different thing, but he acts, he does. He puts people in a room and he says, "You don't leave until we have a solution or something we can implement." So his relationship to the Enlightenment is very paradoxical, but at the end of the day,